This is Stephanie Douglas, A View from Abroad, and this is October the 16th. One of the stories that I've been working on that I mentioned was on getting suicide stats, because suicide statistics are very important in terms of um, understanding who's at risk, who is committing suicide, how do we let the community know what's going on, how do we prevent suicide? Because the root causes of suicide are poverty, mental health, addictions, homelessness, homelessness, housing, inadequate housing, children being taken away because of inadequate housing. All these, food insecurity, all these issues are some of the root abuse, child abuse, sexual violence, family violence, all these are root causes of suicide. And a lot of people who commit suicide have multiple, um, are affected multiply by these issues. I've been, I've worked with people who are suicidal since the 80s when I first took the Victoria Crisis Line training. I have worked as a mental health worker with people who are suicidal, um, or have committed suicide. Um, I have a sister, as I mentioned in a previous podcast, who committed suicide in 1994. And as a journalist, I have covered suicides and suicide prevention extensively. Um, and here on PI, before it was even something that was done, got into a lot of shit for that up in West Prince when I covered a suicide because it's like, no, 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 we have to keep this all silent. And I'm going, silence kills. And that was before we had as much information as we do now that, guess what? Silence kills. And I wrote about it extensively in Rocky Mountain House, Alberta, 2006 to 2007, both on reserve and off reserve suicides. And that year long series, um, I won the Medical and Nurses Association's Excellence in Healthcare Reporting. So I got to be on the same stage as that year's Avis Favreau and Stephanie Nolan, and Jack Layton was in the audience. It was awesome. I couldn't have done that. I couldn't have done those stories without the absolute commitment. In fact, they took the lead by the RCMP in Rocky Mountain House, a town of 6,000, by Victim Services, by the town of Rocky and council and all the different community groups, and both reserves, Sunchild and No Cheese. I couldn't have done those stories. We couldn't have raised the awareness. We could not have changed in that point of time the number of suicides that were taking place. So, suicide to me, suicide, the only way to prevent suicide is through community awareness about the issues. Um, so, silence kills. And so, I am looking at you, the coroner of PI, and you, Brad McConnell, and you, Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Let's see if I can pronounce this right, Sabapathy. Your silence kills. Yes, I'm going to say that again. Coroner's Office, Chief Medical Officer David Sabapathy, Brad Connell, Deputy Chief Brad Connell, and the Chief. Your silence kills Islanders. Period. Fin, punto, es todo. Your silence kills. So I have been trying since August 14th to I started with the coroner's office. They gave me a runaround. Their communications person doesn't read thoroughly the emails, doesn't respond correctly. I have her emails. I can always go through them with anybody who wants me to and explain why they're so useless. And I have called, and so her response was just the communication officers, I think it was Katie something, useless. I have called the Charlottetown Police 4 times, I believe, maybe 5. I have called and left 3 messages for Brad O'Connell. McConnell. I'm terrible with names. Chief, Deputy Chief Brad McConnell, who is their media communications person. 3 times I've left messages. Then I called the chief of police and was gatekeeped by his assistant, Helen McGuigan. And so the chief of police never called me back. So nobody from the Charlottetown Police, their communications officers, ever since August 14th even had the basic decency or respect to call me back. I'm a journalist. I've worked on award-winning newspapers across the country. I am an award-winning journalist. I am a journalist. And it doesn't matter what form my journalism takes, I am still a journalist. And I expect media people, media communications people, to get back to me as they would to anybody on CBC or The Guardian or the Journal Pioneer or the West Prince Graphic or the Eastern Graphic. Disrespect? Tons. But if they disrespect me like that, how are they disrespecting the most vulnerable people in this community? So your silence kills. That's, it damages, it kills. I'm looking at this. Let's see if you can see it. Chief Public Health Office Strategic Plan 2016 to 2018. This strategic plan, created by the Chief Public Health Office, is not worth the paper it is printed on. I'm out of toilet paper, but this is too rough. I was thinking of using it for that. Instead, I'll just use the back for scratch paper. It is not worth the piece of paper it's printed on. Shall we look at why? Well, and I do know from someone in the medical community who has some status, but I have not asked permission to use their name, so I won't. But I do know for a fact, not the numbers, but I do know for a fact that hospital admissions and suicide rates on PEI because of the housing and homeless situation have increased dramatically. So, this strategic plan that isn't worth the paper it's written on, Dr. Sabapathy. The vision, it's health for all islanders. We promote and protect the health of islanders and prevent disease and injury through leadership, partnership, and excellence in public health. The values. We offer effective and efficient public health services with a commitment to continuous quality improvement. Equity. We pursue approaches that enable all islanders to be healthy. Evidence informed. We apply evidence to inform public health practices. Collaboration. We value partnerships, community engagement, and trust. I'm going to say that one again because, hey, collaboration to me is like, you give someone a call back, you talk to them. So, collaboration, we value partnerships, community engagement, and trust. Well, not only did they not engage with me, and I am a community member as well as a journalist doing podcasting journalism, um, do I trust them? Not in your life. Anybody who can't even give you a call back or an email and say, look, we don't have those stats right now, or we're gathering them, or this is what we have, why should I trust them? They've already failed just in basic courtesy. Stewardeships. We make decisions responsibly, act with integrity, and are accountable. I would like to know how they're accountable and how collaboration is so valuable because community engagement and trust, I've tried to engage them. I left a message with the communications officer Autumn for Dr. Sabapathi. I wrote him a very detailed letter about my experience, my credentials, everything. Let's go on with this paper that has no value. So, in here, I took a quick look. They have all these priorities. So I want to get to um, engage stakeholders and foster public awareness about wellness and PI. Can this be seen? There we go. You see that? Well, silence does not do that. So between the city of Charlottetown, I don't know if these people have gotten a heads up not to talk to me, but I am a community member as well as a journalist, and the police are there to serve and protect. There, and so is the chief medical officer, and so is the coroner's office. They are all paid for by all of our taxes, regardless of whether we make income or not. We pay taxes on everything we buy that isn't exempt. So they are our public servants. The government is our public servant. So this silence by the police, I don't know if City Hall directed them not to give any information to anybody that wasn't considered mainstream media. But the mainstream media, as far as I've seen, doesn't do the stories enough, doesn't have the expertise enough, doesn't have 35 years of background in this area enough to do stories that are, yes, gritty, yes, sad, not sensational, but provide information on what's going on PEI, and specifically right now in Charlottetown. Homelessness is a huge issue. Homelessness that was intentional by the city and the province. I've already said that. There's stuff on um, on YouTube and there's stuff on Patreon. It was intentional. And if you don't think so, again, I will say Google the Homeless Hub and then hit PI and read the reports from 2010 to 2016. Suicide and suicide awareness only happens when we as community, when we as journalists, when we as medical and healthcare professionals, when we as police and police stations, detachments, police departments, or like the detachment in Rocky, which was at that time, as far as I'm concerned, a leader in the country in how to solve and how to look at suicide and suicide preventions, because the police or the RCMP, depending on where you're at, are the first responders. They are first responders to the threat when a person is threatening suicide, either because of family violence, drugs and alcohol, other issues. They are the first responders. They are the first responders when a child of 9 or 10 dies by suicide. And they are the first responders if someone who's in their 80s dies of suicide. They are the first responders in every attempt and every suicide. So there's no one more positioned than the police in the community or an RCMP detachment in the community to be collecting statistics and information and ensuring that the community knows this information. Because if I don't know this information and I can't give it to you, then you don't know the information. And if you don't know the information, how are you going to talk to city council or the province and go, we are concerned, we need to do something as a community, like they say, community stakeholders, collaboration, trust, engagement. But if you do not give out information to the community, they cannot be a part of the solution. Your silence kills. Does it seem harsh? It's the truth. Silence around suicide, silence around the root causes, silence by the media chief deputy officer Brad McConnell and the chief of police, silence by the chief medical officer David Sabate. Your silence kills. It's that simple. Because without community awareness, the community can also not talk with each other and go, how can we be a part of the solution? What are we doing to actually be a part of the problem, and how can we be a part of the solutions? So my friends and people on Facebook know that for the last 6 years at least, maybe 7, I have 5, ever since I've been PI for sure, have been a very, very big anti-Bell Let's Talk. Because they raise millions and millions of dollars. And it's all about supposedly raising awareness. And a couple of years ago, they had Wade McLaughlin, the premier, being the poster boy, when at the same time he was actively discriminating against people with mental health issues. So Bell Let's Talk is not working. And just recently there was Suicide Awareness Week and Mental Health Day and all this crap, and people post all over Facebook. And that means bupkis. Nothing. Zilch. Zero. It has no value. It has no value because what it is a meme that people repost and think, oh, there, see, I've talked about it. I've created awareness. No, it doesn't do anything. My daughter actually had a very good perspective about all these social memes, and we don't agree on many things sometimes, and sometimes we don't get along very well. But she is a very brilliant young woman, and what she said is, Mom, compassion without action is simply sentiment. So, what I would say is the same thing, but making a stronger point is compassion without action is armchair sentiment. It's like mental masturbation. It's it. It has no value. It doesn't raise awareness. It doesn't stop people from killing themselves. The only way that we as a community can support the most vulnerable people in our community, the ones who are homeless, the ones who are struggling, the ones who have no food security and are homeless, the new homeless because of the housing crisis in terms of housing costs, housing rates, and all of that, is if you and I speak up to the right people. Because it isn't the homeless person and it isn't the person living on the street. And they're living on the street because the rent is far, far more than what they're getting. And so the only way to keep a roof over their head is by using all their food money, um, which is $190 a month for a single person, clothing money, which is $24 a month, personal items, which is by using all of that to pay rent on a bachelor or one bedroom that's already 625 or 600 or 575, and the ceiling is still 539 for someone on income assistance. But even people who work, and in all these industries that you go to, the barista who serves you coffee at Tim Hortons or Starbucks, the people you see at the grocery store who serve you at the deli, who do the checkout, who serve you in restaurants or diners, most of them are getting minimum wage. And people think, well, they get lots of tips. Well, no, that's a long, long time ago when if you were a server, you actually got to keep your tips. Those tips are now divided. So somebody can work really their ass off and get the same amount of tips as someone who hasn't done crap all day. And those tips and the hours they get are not enough to pay for the cost of housing now. Especially not when you have to pay a month's rent in advance. So you get a substandard place and you have two kids, and the social worker comes in and says, "Oh, your kids can't live in this environment." And you say, "Well, it's all I'm allowed for rent." And they say, "Well, too bad, this isn't a good environment for kids." And you say, "But there's nowhere else for me to go." And they go, "Too bad." They whisk your children away. And you're working. But because PEI has a 48-hour work week and you're only getting 32 or 33, you're not considered full time, so you have no benefits. We have multiple causes and multiple routes of suicide on PEI at this moment. And all of it stems from greed, callousness, and intentionally creating a situation that in the city the size of Charlottetown, in a province that is barely the size of a small city, let alone a city that is barely the size of a small town, should not have. And because of the silence by the city police, the administration at the Charlottetown Police Department, because the administration and the frontline workers, those are totally different. The frontline workers are great as far as I've seen every time. The administration is a different thing altogether. They're the ones who are supposed to speak to the media. They're the ones that are supposed to give information. They're the ones who are supposed to develop the trust. The chief medical officer's office and this report that has no value because they don't do what they say, collaboration, community trust, all that stuff. You can pull this offline, by the way. They do them every 2 years. They do them every 2 years. This is the newest one. I could go through the whole thing and underline every single area in that report that is bullshit. It's just lies. That report, like I said, is not worth the paper it's written on. Because unless they actually do those things, like create trust with the community, engage the community, give information to the community, let the community know what is going on so that the community is aware and can make informed decisions about how to participate, how to help, how to speak up, what they can do in their own communities, how they can be available for their friends and families in ways that they may not have thought of before. That doesn't happen with silence. So I'm wondering if how many of you have seen The Purge? You know those movies where and if you haven't seen The Purge, just don't go to the first one, go to the second or third one. It gives you better information. But The Purge, the movies, the Purge series, is about how one night in America, one night for 12 hours, people are allowed to kill indiscriminately, murder, rape, torture, however they want to kill. They're allowed to kill for 12 hours. But the underlying story, the real story about the Purge, is that the Purge is designed to rid American society of the undesirable population. The poor, the black, the Hispanic, the immigrant, the refugee, the single parents who don't have a lot of money. That's who the Purge is really aimed at, is cleaning up the undesirable people in the country. So I'm wondering if PI has created its own sort of longer term, but essentially the same, because people are dying and people are being hospitalized over and over again and then dying because of multiple issues, exposure, stress, anxiety, mental health issues, and suicide. And they are the most vulnerable of the population, the one who nobody speaks up for because everybody wants to sweep them under the carpet and pretend they don't exist, or use them as scapegoats, saying, look where all our taxes are going, instead of the ministry that is so top heavy on staff and salaries that uh, I'm not even going to go there right now. But maybe PI, Wade McLaughlin, I've told him this to his face. Didn't like it much. But I've told Wade that he's a Harper-esque liberal. He's a little liberal and a big conservative, a la Harper model. Great disdain for the poor, the vulnerable, diversity. Great disdain. Unless he can make money off of it. So, has Charlottetown Police, the chief medical officer, the coroner, taken, um, been told by the premier and city council all this information about suicide prevention, hospitalizations due to people on the streets, hospitalizations, increased hospitalizations in the mental health unit, increased suicides in vulnerable populations. We're going to keep this under wraps. We don't want the community to know because we don't want the community to interfere and actually create solutions, because this way we can get rid of the trash. A made in PEI purge. It's a longer term than And maybe not. Maybe a lot more people die um, in a year than would die if there was one night of 12 hours of killing indiscriminately. I don't know. I don't have the stats on that. But it's something to think of. You think this is like, woo, Stephanie's gone crazy? No. Actually, poverty is an industry, it is a revenue stream. And people who don't understand that need to do more research, need to really think about it. It is a revenue stream. It is a revenue stream for increasing police. It is a revenue stream for increasing um, people in the mental health community, staff, social workers, especially foster care workers, which get way more money than parents. The parents actually do, with way more access to other incidentals than parents do, who are on the system. It's a revenue stream because every time somebody is hospitalized for a day, an emergency, or a couple of days, or who have attempted suicide and are Unit 9, every hospital visit costs between $200 and $22,000 a day. $200 to $2,000 a day. So if you have more suicides, that's police officers, paramedics, victim services, then you need people to actually clean the site. I have a friend in Rocky who, she's executive director of victim services in Rocky Mountain House. She started as a volunteer with victim services, and one of her jobs, was to clean up um, the scenes of crimes and suicide scenes. She did that for a long time. I think she was 17 when she started, 17 or 18. Cleaning the blood, guts, gore, feces, everything of someone who's committed suicide. So, as long as the people with the numbers, the coroner's office, Dr. David Sabapathy, sorry, the chief of police, and especially Brad McConnell, who's supposed to be the deputy chief communications officer, your silence and your total disrespect to me, yes, to me, but your total disrespect to me as a journalist, and not bothering to answer a call, not bothering to get back to me, not bothering to answer an email in all these months, is a direct disrespect to the most vulnerable communities on PEI. Because if you can disrespect me, who has a voice, and believe I have a voice, and I have the right to have a voice, if you disrespect me to such an... I've never experienced this in any city, any province in Canada that I have worked, either in mental health, child protection, or as a journalist. I have never experienced this level of dead silence. Oh, deadly silence. Just like not even the most basic respect of contacting me and saying, well, Stephanie Douglas, we've been told not to give you information, so we're not going to give you information. Great, at least I know. But just total silence, that same silence on the issues of suicide and suicide prevention and hospitalizations and mental health breakdowns due to the root causes of blah, 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 housing, lack of housing, no housing, food insecurity, loss of jobs, an inability to even find an apartment, inability to find an apartment, and then because we now, Iraq, the province has allowed Iraq to charge a full month. You do the math. You're making, say, 1,500 a month, less than 2,000. The apartment is 625 for a one bedroom or a bachelor. A lot of bachelors are 625. You have to come up with $1,250 just to walk in the door, and that has nothing to do with heats and lights and if you have to have Wi-Fi or any other form of communication with the outside world. How can people do that? They can't. That's why Los Angeles and other parts of the states have such an incredible housing poverty and homeless crisis because they can't afford those rates. Why people live in their cars and work because they can't. But we don't even have the housing. The housing isn't even there. So as long as the people who say it is so important to build trust with the community, to communicate, to engage the community, like Dr. Sabapathy and his 2016 to 2018 report, which, like I said, isn't worth the paper it's written on. Your silence kills. Because silence around suicide prevention, silence around the root causes, silence around the determinants of health. By not giving that information to the community cannot make informed decisions of how to expand their energy. And so their solution is to post Facebook memes that don't do anything because the person on the street doesn't have access to Facebook. Or they may be so sick, they may be dying in the street until somebody calls an ambulance for them. Or they may already be dead because they went, I can't deal with this anymore. My children have been taken. I have no housing. I can't work now because I have no housing, so I have no stability. Why bother? If people do not ask the questions and expect an answer, we cannot either individually or collectively create the solutions for the issues that affect people on PI. And it's not just the most vulnerable people, it is affecting people who work two jobs or have two incomes and they cannot find adequate housing or any housing because the whole purpose of and they actually use a word in the PI housing action plan. They use a word on like the second page, gentrification, as if that was something great and wonderful and awesome. And yet in every province where gentrification has happened, it's displaced the people in that community. Like the corner of Upper Prince and Young, that construction up there, which is micro units, short term, and a bed and breakfast in a modest neighborhood that is diverse in both income and in people and abilities, but that kind of thing is going to change the nature of the neighborhood and who can live here. And that also changes how and where people can find housing, or if they can find housing. And if they can't, how does that affect their mental health? People have been stable for decades. How does that suddenly affect them? How does that affect their children? So, yes, the coroner's office, Katie, I think it was McDonald, could be wrong, don't quote me, his communication person, Dr. Sabapathy, who I wrote to directly and who I left a message for Autumn, his communication person, to the city of Charlottetown, who I'm assuming has directed the police not to talk about suicides and hospitalization of the homeless on PEI, or suicides in general, due to poverty and um, isolation and food insecurity, age and poverty and food insecurity, youth and poverty and food insecurity, youth, age, history of abuse, addictions, mental health, poverty, and food insecurity. So, your silence kills. And if this is a maiden PEI purge, that's sad. But more than sad, it's terrifying. And anybody who doesn't see how terrifying it is that the people who are supposed to be speaking up and giving the information and making sure it's out there in the community so the community could come together and form community solutions, as well as take the time to email and write and phone City Hall, Tina Mundy, Ministry of Income Assistance, and of more than anyone, the Minister of Health, and of course, the overseer and prime engineer of all of this, Wade McLaughlin, Premier Wade McLaughlin, our Harper-esque Premier, who is all about money, position, making things look good, and taking out the trash in the form of human beings. Silence kills. It does. Anybody who has ever lost a family member to a suicide or degenerating mental health to the point where they're um, in Unit 9 and may or may not get out because, you know, if their kids, if they don't have housing and their kids are taken and their mental health breaks down and they just don't have any more energy to fight and they have no housing when they get out, where's the hope? So we all need to be aware of root causes of suicide and determinants of health. And anybody who has a computer can plug those words in: root causes of suicide, determinants of health. You can plug them into Google or Google Scholar and get all sorts of research from national organizations. And print off a copy. This is on the website, the government website. Every 2 years, strategic plan 2016-2018. Read it. It's not that big. Doesn't say much. You can scan it. Most of it's bullshit. Or out and out lies like engaging community, um, informing community, engaging community, developing trust, um, wanting community to participate. I'm community. I may be a journalist, but I'm community. My stories are about community, for community, and for community to know what's going on so they can make informed decisions. And I'm going to leave you again with the same message. It is the people who have power, who own property, who own businesses, who own buildings. It's not the poor people. It's not the vulnerable people. It's not the people in Unit 9. It's not the people on the street. It's not the youth. No. It's the business person, the politician. You have a voice that has power. You have the ability to write emails, make a phone call, send a letter to your local police, to the Charlottetown Police, to our chief medical officer, Dr. David Sabapathy, and go, why are we not giving out information on suicide and suicide prevention, and if there's an increase in suicide rates because of the housing? Why is that not happening? Isn't that what your communications officer is supposed to do when a journalist calls or even a community member calls? Why is there media silence when it comes to Stephanie Douglas and her view from abroad? She's a journalist. She's getting information out to the community in different ways. How come there's no basic, even the most basic level of respect of a callback? For me and for everybody who has lost a loved one to suicide, for everyone out there who is grieving the loss of a child, of a friend, of a father, of a mother, of a grandfather, a cousin, an aunt, due to suicide, especially due to suicide because of the root causes, the issues that are affecting islanders, Charlottetown, people in Charlottetown, every single day, which is food insecurity and lack of housing, just among a few. Take a moment and go, if the community had known a little bit more, could the community have done something to start creating solutions? They have in other parts of the world and parts of the country. PI is like 30 years behind talking about suicide and suicide prevention and the determinants of health. And the Charlottetown Police and the public chief medical officer are taking this time when people are the most desperate to be silent. And I will say it again, silence kills. So every day that you're silent and this information doesn't get out to the community and someone dies, as far as I'm concerned, your lack of communication, you are responsible. So, community warrior healers of Charlottetown and the island, especially those of you who own property, who have positions, who have voice, who are white, because black people have, yeah, and Aboriginal people, we just don't have the same voice. Refugees, immigrants, nobody cares about our voice on PI. We're not white enough, we don't have enough. It does make a difference. Contact. I mean, it is an email. You can do this in 5-10 minutes. Send an email to the province. Send an email to the health to the Minister of Health. Send an email to the Chief of Police. Call the media communications person. Say, why are you not giving any information? This information is about supporting the community and protecting the community. Send an email to Dr. David Sabapathy, the chief medical officer. His information is all on the government website. Send him an email. Call his media communications person on him and say, "How can you be so disrespectful? And why did you not answer?" Like just a basic, you know. So if they can, do you understand that basic respect starts all the time? It's like if they can't have basic respect for someone who calls them, say, "Look, I'm doing this, blah blah blah. I'm doing a story about this so I can inform the community," and they can't even be bothered to make any effort to contact me since August with the Charlottetown Police. If they can't have basic respect for someone who actually has the voice and the ability to call them, how are they actually having respect for the very, very most vulnerable people on PI and in Charlottetown? They can't. Because respect is something you show consistently, not just to some people sometime. And the lack of respect by the City of Charlottetown's police department, their administration, by the coroner's office, and by the chief medical officer's office is very telling about how they treat people who are really vulnerable. So, you want to make a difference? You want to actually speak out and not just repost a meme from your armchair or your computer chair that people will like. And like again, compassion without action is armchair sentiment. But as my mom would say, it's just a form of mental masturbation and doesn't do anything for anybody anywhere. So use your voice. Use your voice for the people you love who may be at risk, but for every islander and every child who loses a parent who may be at risk. Community warrior healers, use your voice. Because if I don't and you don't, who will?